So Naomi, we are in this special place today from Tübingen, the Protestant Stift, which was like a place where several famous people lived and studied here, like Hegel, Schelling. And we are here to discuss your work as a New Horizon Fellow from the College of Fellows. And first of all, I'd like to start on a more personal note. So I believe that you had a fascinating academic and life path. So if I'm not wrong, you were born in Scotland, you were raised in Germany, then you lived several years in the US, and then you moved finally to Hong Kong, to China. So could you tell us maybe more about your path, your career, and what moved you, what led you to move to China?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's great to be here. So I was raised in a home that was very open to other cultures, and I think that left an impression on me because from a very young age I had a fascination with China. Where this fascination with China stirred from, I'm not sure, but my guess is it might have been a film that we had in our home. It was about a British missionary called Gladys Aylward, who went to Shanxi in 1930. She was actually applying to join the China Inland Mission, which was the largest Protestant missionary organization. It was interdenominational. It had been founded in 1865 and sent out missionaries from Britain to China to found churches in the inland. That's why the China Inland Missionary Society. And Gladys Aylward had this strong desire to go to China and convert the Chinese. The problem was she was in her later 20s and didn't have a strong ability to learn the language and was then eventually rejected after she tried to study Chinese in London. She saved all her money and took the Trans-Siberian Railway. She ended up in Russia, then Japan, and somehow got to China after being arrested along the way, and joined this elderly missionary in an inn in Shanxi. And when the Japanese invaded that area in the 1930s, the children that she was caring for, she adopted many children and cared for orphans that nobody wanted. She took about 100 children through the mountains and brought them to safety. At the risk of her personal safety and her own life, she was very sick at the time. When I saw this, they made this movie about her because it's a kind of romantic story. And the movie was done with Ingrid Bergman, who was, a very beautiful actress, very glamorous. She ends up falling in love with this Chinese Dutch colonel, and they kiss in the film. All this didn't happen. But there's this beautiful Hollywood romance and story. And I saw that film and I thought, this woman is a heroine, and I suppose I wanted to be like her, or I had this interest in China, this interest in this missionary's life that I thought was very exciting and adventurous. And then, of course, when I started thinking about this seriously, I did eventually find a way to go to China as an adult. I spent some time teaching English in Henan province, which is in central China. I went and learned the language, and I had a lot of questions about religion in China, about why is this religion actually relevant for China? Why are we interested in sharing our faith, and is this a faith that why are some people converting to Christianity? And I thought that for myself, I wanted to explore these questions academically, more systematically. I traveled around the world a bit more and lived in different places, and eventually I embarked on a PhD program at the University of Wales where I studied theology in China. My interest was actually in theological education, because what I thought was interesting was, if this faith is going to sort of become part of religious system in China, then one place you could look at to make any prognosis about the development of Christianity in China is in its theological education, in institutions of theological education. So, as some of you may know, the Protestant church, there is an officially sanctioned, registered church, and called the Three Self-Patriotic movement. The churches under the auspices of the Three Self-Patriotic movement are officially sanctioned, and they have regional seminaries across the country. And what I did initially was I visited these different regional seminaries to try and understand how Protestant theological education works in China. And then I discovered something else. I knew there were also seminaries that belonged to the non-registered churches, which is also very vibrant and growing. It was growing at the time. Christian expression, Protestant churches that are not registered with this Three Self movement. And the problem is I didn't look into this because those churches are technically illegal. And the reason I then went and tried to learn more about the official seminaries was because they're above board. However, I found that despite the fact that they operate publicly, they were also not very willing to share a lot of information. And I came across a completely different strand of Christian engagement in China today, which is the academic study of Christianity at state-run institutions, at universities and tertiary education, where scholars at Beijing University, at People's University in Beijing, Fudan, Zhejiang, many famous Tsinghua University, top universities, actually had scholars who were interested in the history of Christianity in the West. And in other institutions, such as the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, there was also a concentration of scholars who they have this Institute for World Religions, and they study also these religions and the development of religion in China. So I found that this was quite fascinating in a country that educates people in an atheistic education system, that you have scholars in tertiary education who specialize in the study of Christianity despite the fact that theology is not part of that state education system. What I ended up doing then was I wrote my PhD thesis about this field of the academic engagement of Christianity at Chinese universities. And it's a field that, unless you know about China or this particular system, isn't even that well known. Sometimes we read reports about the persecution of Chinese churches, especially. It used to be called underground churches, now we call them house churches. In the Catholic Church, sometimes still those unregistered churches are referred to as underground. And we read about this in Western media, but what we often don't see is that there is a whole other engagement of Christianity in China today, and that is a field that is still developing and still quite interesting and vibrant, I would say.
So it's funny because instead of becoming a missionary, you became, I could say, a world-leading expert of Christianity in China, which is, as you already mentioned, growing and emerging interdisciplinary field. So you already briefly touched upon this, but maybe you could elaborate more on the challenges that you perceive in this field.
Yes, I think there are some challenges, and you mentioned just now this, having a sort of religious vocation that turned into a scholarly one. It's a bit odd in my case because, of course, I never planned on actually going to China as a missionary by profession, since that's not possible. But in the 19th century, there were some missionaries who went with a very vibrant zeal to evangelize the East and ended up becoming themselves enamored with Chinese religions or Chinese philosophy or the Chinese classics. Some of them, a very small, maybe 2%, which is already quite high for missionary scholars in China, they ended up becoming sinologists with a very religious background. The interesting thing about that is that their religious background and this evangelical zeal or the zeal to evangelize turned into a kind of scholarly zeal to find common ground among our civilizations, to the pursuit of universality on a sort of intellectual level. And I think that the missionary ambitions that they had, they didn't completely disappear, but found a different sort of outlet. So there is a tradition of this strange combination. Yeah, to get to your question about the challenges in the field, I think that for religious people who follow Christian developments around the world, there are even organizations dedicated to writing statistics about religious persecution in different countries. And there are also political interests there. The State Department of the United States, for example, every year they publish a report on religious freedom around the world. And this is then used as a tool to show, basically, that the US has religious freedom, other countries don't. To what degree do they not have religious freedom? And China is always on that list. And so there's a perception sometimes, and in the West through media and these kind of political channels too, that there is no Christianity in China, that Christianity is only persecuted. And I think it's good to learn about different expressions of Christianity, but also the institutionalization of something like theological, religious, and Christian studies. The challenge is maybe not to overemphasize one side or the other, because there's so much complexity to the development of religion in China. For example, the Chinese state only recognizes 5 religions: Buddhism, Catholicism, Protestantism, Taoism, and Islam. Judaism isn't even in there. Most Chinese religions aren't actually in there, because China is a country full of religious diversity, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity that is not represented in the 5 religions that are officially recognized. So there's a challenge, I think, between complicating and problematizing the issues, but also acknowledging, for example, where persecution of religious minorities, religious groups, religious individuals does happen and is a reality for people. But to find that balance and objectivity as a scholar, I think, is important.
So would you say that maybe also one challenge would be projecting on the Chinese context some, let's say, preconceived categories which are meaningful more like in the European and Western context? Like I'm thinking, for instance, like a very classical notion of religion itself, which would be separated from philosophy, or even the notion of theology, which many argue originated in this Christian context. Some argue that there is no Jewish or Muslim theology. I think that that's polemical, but let's put this aside. So would you say that there is maybe a danger to somehow oversimplify the situation because we work with these categories which maybe are not adapted to the Chinese context, or maybe we should adjust them?
Absolutely. So a lot of these terms actually religion is one example, came into Chinese discourse vocabulary via Japan, and that was the Japanese term shokyo. You can read up about that in the history
of the shokyo mean?
Religion. And 宗教, that's the Chinese characters, or how the Chinese characters are pronounced in Mandarin, which actually is this teaching of the school, jiao. So you use jiao generally for religious teaching. But jia, for example, if you talk about Confucianism, the Chinese term is different. It's not Confucianism. Rujia and jia is also a school of thought, but these are actually different. And you might have, for example, in Chinese you distinguish in Taoism between Dao Jiao and Dao Jia. So I think that yes, when we study religion in another country, we as Western scholars, of course, we impose our vocabularies, and to an extent there's a way to avoid this when you're bridging meanings, which I think, we're not always doing justice, of course, but we're just trying to understand, and also then trying to communicate things that we've learned. The other thing is that these vocabularies, ideological, isms and all that kind of thing, that was also imported into Chinese discourse in the 19th and 20th centuries. And you could also say, well, these schools of thought, whether they're Marxism, liberalism, and different Western schools of thought, they have also become established in the Chinese context. So we can talk about a Chinese Marxism, a Chinese Christianity, Chinese liberalism, Chinese leftism, and as long as I think Chinese scholars or Chinese practitioners are using this terminology themselves, we can translate it back and then, like I said, again, try to see where the differences lay and how faithfully to represent those. And of course, I mean, I'm hugely limited as a foreigner, but I also find it a privilege to be able to communicate, to write about things that I learn. And, sometimes I talk to my friends or scholars in China. Sometimes they will correct me, or they'll say, oh, that's interesting. So, the conversation is always ongoing, and I think scholarship is a process of learning.
It's really fascinating what you just said, that there is, like you could say, a back and forth moment of translation. Like first, Chinese people or culture translated terms from Western languages, and now we have to translate back terms that they translated from us, like Marxism and other terms. And let's turn now to your scholarly work, which is very rich. So in your book, Studying Christianity in China, you explore how scholarly discourse about Christianity in China has been constructed, and what initially drew you to investigate not the religion itself, but the discourse surrounding it.
Yeah, I think that at this point where we find that scholarship has turned to the study of the West, I wanted to know, then why Western religion? And I think for Chinese scholars, they also see Christianity as an important key. Whether that's figures like Augustine, Calvin, and their interpreters, Max Weber, the philosophers that you study, these are such key thinkers for the Chinese to understand and reinterpret the West, to understand modernity, its challenges, and reinterpret what could a Chinese modernity mean. And this is all theology and the Christian history, church history, is all a part of the Chinese digestion of the West. But an interesting parallel or concomitant phenomenon to that has been scholars who, in the wake, so after the Cultural Revolution, became enamored with Christian ideals or Christian thinkers and liberal ideas. Western authors, whether they're Russians or Americans or British authors, there was a kind of cultural fever in the 1980s, so the years of the early reform and opening after the end of the Cultural Revolution, when intellectuals turned to Western ideologies, but also to Christianity, and began to investigate Christianity, both as the scholarly endeavor that I've been talking about, but also as a lived faith. And these two things happening together, that was very fascinating, and also produced a rich intellectual engagement with the faith in the 1980s, but also in the 1990s, when we see Christian artists reinventing Christian themes, merging them with Chinese traditional art, for example, these sorts of things. So I think this intersection is quite interesting. So not that this movement, this scholarly movement to study Christianity is necessarily a faith endeavor for most of those scholars, but there is also another faction of intellectuals who became Christians, who even founded churches in larger cities in China, who began to write and explore a theology for the Chinese church in the present era. So those are all interesting developments.
And would you say that the reception of Christianity in China and the engagement with Christianity after the Cultural Revolution, which you just mentioned, was rather different than its reception through the encounter with the first missionaries in China. Because, I mean, the reception of Christianity in China, of course, it was much before the Cultural Revolution.
Yes, of course. So, actually, Christianity in China has a very, very long history that goes all the way back to the Tang Dynasty. Then during the Yuan Dynasty, the Franciscans came, and very famously, of course, the Jesuits in the late 16th century, in the late Ming and Ching. And in the Ching, then in 1807, Robert Morrison went to China, a Protestant Anglo-Scottish missionary. That history, so that's a long history of the missionary history. But what I want to emphasize at this point is that in the 1980s, China also already had a history of Chinese Christianity that was independent of missionary Christianity, the denominations that the missionaries brought. China had its own denominations that developed, especially in the Republican era in the early 20th century, denominations that we actually don't have in the West and that started in China. Yeah, there was always some connection to a missionary or a missionary movement or someone being friends maybe or being mentored by a missionary, but there are churches and styles of Chinese Christianity that developed long before this time. So at that point, in the 1980s, when these intellectuals were showing an interest in Christianity, in fact, Christianity already had a history in China that was not completely distinct from missionary Christianity, but that had somewhat already separated. So there were always these different streams of indigenous, independent movements, and they'd been around for a century before this intellectual engagement that I've been talking about. But these scholars, perhaps, they didn't have a connection to that history. So they didn't come from families with a Christian background, where maybe they could trace their Catholic history back 4, 5, 6 generations. That you have that today, but some of these intellectuals were coming to the faith like as a very new intellectual engagement. But not to forget that there was at this point a Chinese Christianity, or there were Chinese Christianities rather, in the plural. And that's also, I think, important to remember.
This is absolutely fascinating. So it is as if China reinvented Christianities. And so I found it so interesting what you were telling about these new Christian denominations. And could you maybe give an example of a Christian denomination which doesn't exist in the Western world, so to say?
Okay, let me give an example that some people may or may not know. Maybe in the Christian world, people are familiar with Nituosheng, or Watchmanese little flock. So Xiaoqun is the kind of conventional name given to it. That's also actually calls itself the local church. And that developed out of, actually the founder of this church movement, the local church movement, didn't want to found a new denomination because he said, really, we shouldn't have denominationalism in the church, but the Christian church should develop wherever it goes. In every city there should be one church. And this one church, the idea of the local church, was not supposed to be something new or some reinvention of Christianity, but it had then that reputation because that particular church didn't associate with all the other denominations that were there, whether they were Christian denominations from overseas or other Chinese churches, indigenous churches. So Nituosheng's little flock, Nituosheng also, he died in prison, he was arrested, he had a very tragic experience, but his followers, they have spread around the world. So they went to Taiwan, the United States, and if you go to Leipzig, Germany today, you can find a local church that speaks Chinese but also German. And this is an example of the globalization of Chinese Christianity, which I just called it Chinese Christianity. And as I said, they wouldn't call themselves a denomination, but they are a Chinese expression of the Christian faith.
And you argue that the study of Christianity in China is shaped by multiple intellectual traditions, Chinese, Western, and more broadly speaking, interdisciplinary traditions. So how do these traditions converge or clash in shaping the field today?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and I think the interdisciplinariness of this field is what makes it vibrant, but it's also a necessity because there is no theology as an academic discipline in the Chinese university system. There's philosophy, religious studies, literary studies, political science, comparative religious studies. In all these fields, you might have scholars who engage Christianity or Christian thought on some level. Clashes might come where these scholars are engaged, like I hinted at before, in a critique of modernity, and where this interest in Christianity can also turn to a criticism of Christianity and its influence on the modern West, and even a rejection of Christianity, which then that becomes problematic maybe for some of the confessional scholars, and there are some differences there. Some scholars went overseas to study theology, to do a doctorate in theology, and have developed maybe their own overseas Chinese theological pursuits. I could talk a bit more about that. It's another story, but we see this academic study of Christianity developing into different fields, including confessional theologies today.
You mentioned several times during our discussion that there would be somehow a kind of link between critique of modernity and engagement with Christianity in China. So could you maybe elucidate this link?
Right, I think that's the understanding of Protestantism leading to modernity as we have it in the West today, and of Protestantism in terms of constantly reforming itself, almost reforming itself away maybe into something like a religion of rationality, maybe in Lessing's sense, if we talk about that. And a very popular text in China, at least when I was living in mainland China a decade ago, was Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic. And so there was at one point, a lot of discussion about that. What does this mean? What does this mean about our understanding of the West? How do we want to be different from, how do we want our own modernity to develop vis-a-vis contradistinction to Western modernity? Mm-hmm. But religion plays a role in the understanding of that modernity, that's for sure. And I would also attribute the popularity currently of patristic studies, and specifically this focus on Augustine as a pivotal figure in Western intellectual history, standing at the beginning of this modern process. As he's interpreted by some, there are many controversial theories about Augustine, and did he invent Western individualism as we know it, as it later developed, this kind of thing. But at least that's a question in Chinese scholarship too. And you can find that there is now a growing field to patristic studies with very selective figures though in Chinese scholarship.
And what do you see as the most significant misconceptions, either as scholarly or public, that persist about Christianity in China, and how does your research challenge them?
So I think sometimes I come across people still in the religious and the Christian world who ask me, oh, I thought there was no religion in China, there's no Christianity. And we call that the persecution narrative. As I mentioned, there is persecution of religious individuals and very serious infringements of religious rights in China today, as we know. But there's also religious life. So we shouldn't, we should always remember these two sides, and maybe that's a persistent conception that because there are certain infringements or restrictions, that then there's no religious life at all, and that's not true.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are the main reasons why people in China decide to convert to Christianity?
That's a good question, thank you for that. And I thought about it because I was asked this question the other day, and I feel that the religion conversion question, there are as many reasons as there are people who convert, I suppose. one reason that is sometimes mentioned is the family that a church offers. For example, someone in urban China who moves to a big city for the first time and joins a church, even, let's say they have had Christianity in their family but have become estranged from the church and come back to it when they're in this kind of a setting where family is important, but the church takes on that role. Others, actually, you could talk about something like an intellectual conversion. So I know people like that who are interested in Christianity and its theology and find it plausible, convincing. And I think, and the others who grow up in a Christian family are converted through friends. All the stories that you'd hear anywhere. And an overwhelming reason? Good question. I'll think about it as one.
And would you say that there are some forms of Christianity which are more appealing to Chinese people, like Catholics and Protestants? What about the Orthodox?
Yeah, so the Orthodox Church is very small in China. There's some history, but the most common church that you will find in China today is a fairly evangelical Protestant church. It's talking about the Protestant sector. And the interesting thing, this is actually mentioned a lot, that if you go to an officially sanctioned Protestant church in a big city in China today, the songs that are sung, maybe the sermons that are preached, and even the general atmosphere is not that different from the sort of general theological beliefs in a Chinese house church. Yeah, there are some differences because house churches may meet in a home or office space or that kind of thing, and the officially sanctioned churches often have the old missionary buildings, so it's more like a church feel. But in terms of their theology, they often tend to be pretty mainline evangelical, sometimes more conservative even than in evangelical churches in the West, but that always depends. That is a common type of theology.
And your forthcoming book, Moltmann in China, analyzes how Jürgen Moltmann's theology has been received and interpreted within the development of Chinese academic theology. And what have you found most illuminating about this intercultural dialogic process, particularly in how Chinese scholars engage with Moltmann from Marxist thought, political philosophy, and broader Western intellectual history?
Okay, thank you very much for asking me about my forthcoming book, hopefully this December. Moltmann in China, Reception and Dialogue. So the reason it's entitled Reception and Dialogue is because I'm looking not only as Moltmann studies in China and its reception history, but also how it's a two-way process. We talked before about translation, right, and translating back. So someone reads Moltmann in China, Moltmann dialogues with these scholars who read his work, and he responds to their scholarship about him in a Chinese context. So that was a two-way street, because Moltmann, the last 40 years that he was alive, he passed away in June 2024, he traveled to China fairly regularly, spent time in Hong Kong, had conferences in Taiwan, and he spoke with Chinese theologians and Chinese scholars and other disciplines. There was a dialogue and a two-way street about this theological reception that we don't necessarily find with other theologians, because either they don't go to China or they don't engage at the level that he did, to the point that to date about 19 of his books have been translated into Chinese, which is a lot for a contemporary theologian. And Moltmann himself was also interested in China. He was interested in the Chinese tradition. And when we published an edited volume about scholars who have written essays on Moltmann in Chinese, this was published with Brill in English also, but Moltmann specifically insisted that we add an essay of his that he wrote years ago and that has been republished in different works, and that is his essay on the Theology and how it's read through Western eyes. But not just Western eyes, but the eyes of a Western theologian. So he looks at wisdom and the Hebrew Bible and compares this to the Dogma. These kinds of thoughts that maybe Western theologians have had before, but he expresses them, I think, with a due humility and, saying, this is how I read it, how I understand it. Maybe it's totally wrong, but I'm very interested in your tradition. I'm interested in your communalism, the different ways that you practice religion, that you honor your ancestors, things that we as Western theologians or Western Christians can learn from Chinese culture.
And let us add that Moltmann lived onward in Tübingen, where we are here today.
Yeah.
And one last question. So, Moltmann, as you know, is famous for having developed a theology of hope. And this theology of hope can inspire liberation theologies, which strive for more justice and transformation in our current societies. So would you say that Moltmann inspired liberation theologies also in China?
I think the interest in liberation theology on the side of Chinese thinkers, I wouldn't necessarily credit Moltmann with that because of the timing. What Chinese scholars have been particularly interested in, and more than in his first big important book, The Theology of Hope, they were more interested in his second major work, The Crucified God, his book of 1972, that was translated into Chinese, but is now being retranslated with commentary, and that will be coming out quite soon as a new translation. This has generated a lot of interest in Chinese discourse, because I think there are impulses in that book that are interesting, of course, for Christians, but I think for Chinese society too. And the liberative thrust of Moltmann's theology dialogues well with Marxism, and of course then that gives him a very smooth entry into Chinese scholarly discourse, I think.
Thank you, Naomi, for this wonderful interview.
Thank you so much.